I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding, and I want to thank you all for coming out on a somewhat forbidding day. I feel like I should be addressing you in the military parlance of the few and the proud, but I am grateful for everybody in the room, particularly because we have an outstanding panel today. We're going to discuss American troops and the challenge of, post-service reintegration. Today, as you all know, the United States is coming to the end of 13 years of uninterrupted warfare, and for many, these wars have been a distant issue. And as we wind down, these wars and their costs seem even more remote in the consciousness of many in our nation. We are reminded, for example, at the State of the Union address, as the President praised Army Ranger Corey Remsburg and recounted how he was grievously wounded and how he had persevered against overwhelming odds. But for many, this is a once-in-a-year remembrance. The reality, however, is this cannot and must not be a once-in-a-year event. The numbers tell a staggering story. In the course of these 13 years, more than 2.5 million men and women have served in combat zones in Iraq and Afghanistan. Close to 7,000 have died, and the official tallies show roughly 52,000 were wounded in action, and those statistics are easily sobering enough. Even more striking, however, are the numbers of those who don't show up in the columns of numbers, but perhaps should. A study by the RAND Corporation suggested that some 14%, or about 350,000 post-9/11 veterans, have experienced the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, whether or not they've been formally diagnosed. An additional 14% suffer from major depression. How well is the nation coping with the challenge of these many wounded warriors? Are we keeping trust with those who were sent off to war to defend us? To discuss these questions today, we have quite an impressive panel of experts. To my far right, but only geographically, General Carter Ham is here wrapping up a fabulous 2-week stay at the Dickey Center. I believe he has probably met more Dartmouth undergrads and faculty in his time here, in his 2 weeks here, than I have, I think, in more than a year. He was most recently the head of the U.S. Africa Command. He has been commander of the U.S. Army in Europe. He served a number of years in Iraq, and he has been a vocal advocate for treatment and screening of post-traumatic stress disorder after his own experience following a suicide bombing in Iraq. To my far left, but also just geographically, James Wright is Professor Emeritus and Eliezer Wheelock Professor of History at Dartmouth. As you all know, he was the 16th president of the college, and he served in that position from 1998 until 2009. A member of the Dartmouth faculty since 1969, Jim Wright also served as dean and as acting president of the college and as provost before he was elected president in April of 1998. A former Marine, in 2005, President Wright began a series of visits to U.S. military medical facilities in Washington, D.C., where he met personnel who had been wounded in the course of service in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in over 24 visits since then, he has encouraged these injured servicemen and women to continue their education, and he has joined in establishing and assuming responsibility for raising funds to support an educational counseling program for wounded veterans. He is also the author of the acclaimed book, which came out in 2012, Those Who Have Borne the Battle, A History of America's Wars and Those Who Fought Them, which provides a historical overview of American views of war and those who have fought in them, from the American Revolution to our current wars. And he shares many of his own experiences and insights in that excellent book. To my immediate right, Paula Schnurr is Acting Executive Director of the Veterans Administration National Center for PTSD. She is a research professor of psychiatry at the Geisel School of Medicine here at Dartmouth, and she is a renowned expert on the subject of PTSD and its effects. She has written or co-edited more than 100 chapters, books, and journal articles. She also did her doctorate here at Geisel and was a postdoctoral fellow here in 1985. Finally, to my immediate left, Chris Allen, class of 15, is the current president of the Dartmouth Undergraduates Veterans Association. A Connecticut native, he enlisted after high school as a combat engineer in the U.S. Army. He was deployed with the 95th Sapper Company to Iraq in January 2009 and did a 12-month tour conducting route clearance and training Iraqi Army personnel in command and control. An economics major, Chris has also worked during the summer for the St. Louis-based organization The Mission Continues, which empowers veterans adjusting to life at home to find new missions. He works with Project Right Choice here at Dartmouth, one of whose projects is to focus on providing hope and opportunity for homeless vets in New Hampshire. And he has also worked with Project Vet Care, a consortium of veterans in New Hampshire who are working to help fellow veterans navigate and gain access to various resources available to them and their families. As you can see, this is as good a panel as one could get on this subject, and I'm going to now ask the participants, beginning with General Ham, to give us brief statements.
Well, thanks very much, Ambassador Benjamin. It's good to be back here in the auditorium one more time to talk about a particularly important topic, not just for service members and veterans and their families, but I think for the nation. It is indeed a national issue. I joined the Army, enlisted in the Army in 1973, so in the immediate post-Vietnam era. And in my cohort, as we progressed and experienced through the service, our deployments were short and not very often involving significant combat operations. For myself, I did a tour in Saudi Arabia, but during Desert Storm, but did not experience any combat. Served in Kuwait, in the Balkans, in Qatar, but in none of those deployments did we experience loss or combat operations. All that changed for me in 2004 when I served in Mosul, Iraq in 2004, 2005. And as many in this room know, getting shot at the first time has a pretty significant effect on the rest of your life. Getting mortared, getting blown up a couple of times, all of that changes your outlook on things. And I do recall one humorous incident at our small hospital in Mosul, Iraq. One day, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld was visiting, and he actually was quite good with wounded soldiers, and so he was visiting them. And as typical for the Secretary of Defense, there's a flock of reporters with him, and so the Secretary is moving on. A reporter kind of sticks her camera and microphone, and a soldier who's there, and she said, "What's it like getting shot at?" And the soldier, in typical American soldier response, says, "Well, ma'am, it's not so bad getting shot at, but getting hit really sucks." You know, as Dan mentioned, for me, the worst day of my life was the 21st of December of 2004, when a suicide bombing in our dining facility killed 22, 14 American service members, 4 Iraqi soldiers, and 4 contract civilians. That was a devastating loss. I didn't know it at the time, but that changed me. We had lost soldiers, lots of soldiers, in the weeks and months preceding, and in the weeks and months after. But that single incident, and so much loss, so much tragedy, about 70 wounded. It changed me. During that period of deployment, 2004, 2005, the services started to understand that they needed to do something to help service members upon return from a combat zone. But it was, while well-intentioned, I think it was not particularly effective. And the focus was more on how do you socially reintegrate into civilian society? How do you reconnect with your spouse? Because roles changed. Many of you have deployed, and you know that, and you've got to recraft that. Kids change and grow up and are different. Your friends are different. the pace of life is different. And so that was more the focus of the reintegration training. Again, very well intentioned, mostly led by chaplains, because this was not viewed as a medical matter, but rather as a social matter in readjusting. But even with that, there was an abiding sense that tough guys do just fine. You know, we don't need this. Tough guys will be just fine in reintegration, and frankly, all this warm and fuzzy stuff is for wussies. You know, we don't need to do that. And I'll put myself probably in that latter category. That I guess intellectually I said, yeah, there's probably some goodness in this, but my sense was it was really was for the junior soldiers. They needed this. You know, those of us, non-commissioned officers and particularly senior officers. I was a 1-star at the time. You know, we don't need this. This is for them. So I got back to Fort Lewis, Washington, and in typical Army fashion, was there about 3 days before we headed to our new assignment, and my wife and I drove from Tacoma, Washington to Washington, D.C. I probably said 2 words to her the whole way. I was pretty much an asshole. I didn't think so, and frankly, she didn't say so, because there was a part of her that was just happy to have me back, because some, of course, didn't make it. I went to a new job, my first job at the Pentagon. It was busy. I found it particularly unfulfilling, and I found myself longing to be back in combat. How could I possibly be here in safety when my friends, my comrades, were still in the fight, and I felt that that's where I needed to be. I wasn't sleeping all that well. I certainly was a pretty crappy husband, not much of a father, not much of a friend. I found myself kind of going through the motions of life. I didn't really realize it at that time. And it was brought to the fore to me by a very strange way, by my dog. When I left Fort Lewis, Washington to deploy to Iraq, our daughter in Georgia took care of my dog. Maggie is her name. And so when we moved to Washington, D.C., and after a couple of months, there was a break in the action, and we were able to go to Georgia to see my daughter and her husband. And so we get out of the car, we open the door on the house opens, and Maggie comes bounding out of the house, leaps into my arms, and I start bawling like a baby. And it dawns on me, this is not normal. My wife, who should have said, I told you so, didn't. And she said, it's going to be okay, but you probably need to talk to somebody. And for me, that somebody was a trusted Army chaplain. To be able to have a conversation to say to all those things, I don't feel fulfilled, I don't feel like I'm making a difference. And that chaplain helped guide me through this and say, guess what? You're not the first person that this ever happened to. And you can work through it. And she helped me work through that in a very powerful way. Fast forward about a couple of months, and a very wise senior commander, the guy that had been, was a 3-star, that had been the Corps commander at Fort Lewis, Washington when we all deployed, brought us back. So we'd been home for a couple of months. He brought us back to Fort Lewis, Washington, got a battalion commander, so lieutenant colonels, the colonels, and me, and our spouses, specifically to talk about how are you doing in this post-deployment era? And of course, the answer was, we're all fine. And it was the spouses who said, no, you're not. You might be fine, but you're different. And I in that audience, related my story about Maggie and going to get some help. I found other good outlets. I mean, I started to feel better about myself. I actually talked to my wife, which was a bit of a surprise to her, I think, but that worked out okay. And I found fulfillment in talking to, and going to Walter Reed and talking to soldiers and families who were back, many of them who I knew and had served with me in Iraq. I got engaged with the USO and other organizations, found that to be pretty worthwhile. But I didn't talk a lot about my personal story. I got outed by Deborah Mullen, the wife of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Admiral Mullen and Mrs. Mullen happened to be visiting Fort Lewis and the medical center and the units there, and they were talking about post-traumatic stress and post-deployment issues. And somebody said, well, there's this general that, you know, he had some problems and he did okay, and he talked with us about it and made a big difference. And Mrs. Mullen says, well, who was that? You wouldn't know him, he's some Army guy. She said, well, tell me. They said, well, it's Carter Ham. She says, I know Carter Ham. And so Deborah Mullen told Admiral Mullen, and my secret was out. But it actually was for a good cause. There's a lot of goodness that came from me at that time talking publicly about my experience. And my rationale, my hope for that was if a general can say, hey, I struggled with this. I needed a little bit of help. I got a little bit of help. And it didn't hurt me. I ended up as a 4-star. I did okay. You know, so you're not going to damage your career if you come forward. And my thought was, if one other soldier read that story and said, it's okay for me to go get some help too, then that would be worthwhile. So this is personal to me. It's personal because of the soldiers that I love and their families, and I worry that as we go forward, and with the frequency of deployments diminishing and the attention of the nation focusing elsewhere, that our national attention on this issue will start to drop off. And soldiers and their families who very much need our support and very much need our care will perhaps not be able to get the same care that I and others have had. So I'm a big fan of what Paul and others are doing. I think we've got to continue our efforts in that regard to help those who have defended us and fought for us in the years ahead. Thanks.
Thank you very much, General Ham. Paula, over to you.
It's hard to know what to say after such a wonderful story. I'm here to talk about PTSD. It's not the only thing we want to talk about. It's certainly not the only thing that happens to people when they go to war, but just to set the record straight. However, I don't think I could tell you anything better than you just heard. So thank you, General Ham. I am glad to be here for a variety of reasons, to be with such interesting and distinguished people, but also a bit of payback. My career, I owe a large part of my career to Dartmouth veterans. Actually, the first project I did was studying the Dartmouth classes of 67 and 68 to understand how going to Vietnam or not going to Vietnam affected people's lives. And I got hooked, essentially, and people gave very generously of their time to help us. We did a groundbreaking study here. And I think since that point in time, we've come a very long way in understanding what PTSD is. So I have some bullet points. I just want to give some facts and set the table for further discussion. Now, the medical literature has recognized the condition that we now call PTSD for years. I think the first public record scholars debate this is probably the Great London Fire in the 1600s. People are describing what sounds like PTSD. But the name PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, did not come into being until 1980 when the American Psychiatric Association put it in its diagnostic manual. By formalizing the diagnosis like this, research grew substantially, understanding grew substantially to help focus on something that had been part of the human condition essentially forever. However, the attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center on 9/11 really were a game changer, I think, for the public and for the scientific community. A lot has happened since, and the veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan have really helped keep the focus on among my colleagues, and I think among journalists and people in this room, and that's all a very good thing. Now, with this focus, unfortunately, there's a downside, and PTSD has become a catch-all word. People talk about having a bad experience with an exam and they got PTSD from an exam. Or they assume that every veteran has PTSD, or every veteran is crazy, and that anyone with PTSD is crazy. And so I want to step back, and I hope it's not too dry, just to give you some basic information that you can use to really understand what it is and what it isn't. And now I'll put my reading glasses on so I can make sure what I tell you is true. So first of all, PTSD, as I was saying, it's not just a bad experience with an exam. PTSD is not everyday stress. It's not just readjustment problems that many veterans experience when they come back from the war zone. It's a psychiatric condition that can happen to people when they've been exposed to a life-threatening traumatic event, such as combat, such as being raped or physically assaulted, being in a serious accident, and so on. The symptoms of PTSD include re-experiencing the event through unwanted memories or nightmares, avoiding reminders of the event, feeling sort of numb and cut off, or maybe feeling guilty, changing how you think about yourself, and also being really keyed up, hyper-aroused and easily startled. Now, the fact is that almost all of us have some of these symptoms if we experience a traumatic event. Odds are some people in the room, for example, have, because 50 to 60% of the U.S. population will have had that. Auto accidents are common, for example. So you may know from firsthand what I'm saying. You have these symptoms, but in the days and weeks that follow the event, they tend to go away or they become pretty low level. We don't diagnose PTSD until the symptoms have lasted at least 30 days and they're severe. So that's why PTSD is a disorder. PTSD is not just stress. Now, about 6% of the U.S. population will have PTSD at some point in their lives, roughly twice as many women as men, and we don't quite know why that is. Some of it has to do with the kind of experiences that women have, because women, for example, are more likely to be sexually assaulted, and different types of events are more or less likely to lead to PTSD. But we really don't fully understand that gender difference. It just is what it is. It appears, by the way, that among women who have experienced combat, there isn't a gender difference, so men and women seem to be more equally likely to get PTSD from combat. Now, prevalence is higher in populations that have a lot of exposure, so veterans have a higher prevalence than the general population. All veterans don't have PTSD, but as you heard, about 14 or 15% of the veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan have PTSD. In the VA system where I serve, because we're a medical facility and the prevalence of psychiatric disorders tends to be a little higher there, 1 in 4 men and 1 in 5 women have PTSD. It's roughly about 25% of our patient population among the youngest returning veterans, the OEF, OIF, as we say, veterans who've served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, the prevalence is somewhat unknown in all other war cohorts. To the best guess I can make right now, probably in World War II veterans, 2 to 4%. In Vietnam veterans, the last time we had a really good snapshot of the Vietnam cohort was in the mid-1980s. And at that point, it was around 15%. This year, we're expecting new publications to report on prevalence in Vietnam veterans among the men and the women who served. But it's really hard to make comparisons across war eras because, for example, we were not studying World War II veterans in the way that we're studying now veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. We know from a lot of other sources that PTSD was a very prevalent disorder. We were calling it combat fatigue or war neurosis or something like that. But we don't have too many benchmarks, except I was asked to prepare some comments on this kind of comparison. The 15% in the Vietnam cohort in the mid-1980s seems high, because that's roughly 20 years after many of these men and women got back from their service. And I certainly hope the prevalence in Iraq and Afghanistan veterans is not 15% in 20 years. I hope we've done a better job at recognition and treatment and helping people transition out of having PTSD. So I think it's a hard scientific question, and I don't know that it's that productive to answer, but possibly the Vietnam cohort had an even higher prevalence. But I would say 15% is too high. 15% is what we're looking at now for our returning veterans, and we want to do something about that. Now, some people think PTSD is a sign of weakness. I think, General Ham, you've probably heard that sentiment many times over. And it's true, it doesn't happen to everyone, but it can happen to anyone. How often it occurs depends on a variety of factors, not a person being weak necessarily, but a lot of what a person has experienced before being traumatized. The event itself makes a big difference, and what happens afterwards, what we call the recovery environment. All of these factors combine to make a person more or less likely. So, for example, the amount of exposure to an event, I would argue that a suicide bombing with that many fatalities would be very likely to lead to PTSD. We know that from other sources because it is so horrific. In contrast, after the fact, things like having good support from family and friends, even if the reintegration piece isn't enough, I mean, it does help. Lack of further stressors, so people who come back home and don't have support and they lose their job and there's economic issues, all of that could conspire to make PTSD more likely. Now, PTSD is not a lifelong disorder. I wanted to get that point out because many people believe once they have it, they can't get rid of it. It's true for some people, but it can be treated, and many people can recover or recover enough to live a life that they want to live. I think in the interest of time, I just want to move along quickly, but I would like to get back to student veterans because that's what you're going to hear from Chris Allen next. We don't know how many student veterans have PTSD. There haven't been definitive studies. You might argue it would be low because these are people who, after all, they got themselves into college, right? So they're resilient, they're protected. But on the other hand, going to college may produce further stress. It certainly did in my case, and perhaps it could exacerbate problems. We simply don't know. But regardless, we do know that many veterans, whether or not they have PTSD, face unique challenges when they come back to school. And I think that it's really important that we're here to talk about that. So, Chris, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks for that, Paula, and for giving us those facts on PTSD. So what I'd like to do is kind of start by telling you about my personal transition. Coming to college, I was out of the Army 3 months before I came to Dartmouth. So it's a pretty fast turnaround. I graduated high school in '07. Less than 2 years later, I was in Iraq, and less than 2 years later, I was here. So it was a very quick transition for me. And building off of what Paula said, something I'm always very quick to point out is that not every veteran has PTSD, and that's something that she and I spoke about ahead of time. I'm always kind of reticent to say that I'm an OIF vet because I feel like there's a lot of connotations and feelings about what that means on campus. So I'd just like to tell you about my transition. So just because I tell people that I had a very smooth transition coming out of the military, going right into Dartmouth, that's not to say that I wasn't dealing with some very personal struggles and trying to reconcile some thoughts that I had about leaving the service. And so one of the main things, right when I got out, my unit was preparing to head back to Afghanistan. And so what I was dealing with coming here in the fall of 2011 was the fact that a lot of the guys that I was in Iraq with, well, I was in Hanover, New Hampshire, enjoying myself, going on trips. They were in Afghanistan, and they were dealing with some far tougher situations than we dealt with in Iraq. And I was here maybe a month and a half when I got an email from one of my platoon mates saying that Sergeant so-and-so had broken his back. They got hit with a pretty large IED. It's not looking good. And so I was kind of thinking this through and trying to reconcile the fact that I was at an Ivy League institution and all these guys that I had worked with, lived with, fought beside, We're kind of still working through this. And I know that's something that a lot of the veterans here have to reconcile within themselves. And stepping back from national service is something that I personally struggled with. So that kind of leads into why I've taken such a major role in the nonprofit world, both on the national and local level, why I'm just completely dedicated to those nonprofits serving veterans. And honestly, if I'm going to tell you the truth, I'd say that's probably just as much for me as it is for them to reconcile that, I don't want to say guilt, but some of those thoughts I have with the fact that I'm here and some of my friends aren't. So that's something that I'm currently working through now. There's also a lot of practical issues that all the veterans here have to deal with. So one thing I was worried about was interacting with students when I came here, right? So that's the reason we're here, is to interact with the traditional students and give them our perspectives and maybe add to their college experience. And I was really worried about the questions that I was going to get asked when I first came here. And I was here for maybe a day and a half, and my worst fear came true. A student came up to me and said, "Have you ever killed somebody?" And I didn't know what to do. I kind of froze. This is everything I had worried about coming back to college. I was dealing with these kind of questions. I just didn't know what to do. And I turned around and I looked at him and I said, that's something that I don't really feel comfortable talking about. And I just left it at that. And he said, "You know what? Okay." And he walked away. And that was it. And after that, I got a lot more comfortable with interacting with students and saying, I feel comfortable talking about this. I don't really want to talk about this topic. And the students here have been great about dealing with that and kind of helping us through that transition process. Some of the other things that we had to deal with when I first came here, I think there were, maybe 3 or 4 veterans. When my class came in, and we had 5. So things that we had to think about were living conditions, right? When you come back and I was the youngest veteran, I was 22. Living on a freshman floor with 18-year-olds that are away from their parents for the first time is something to keep in mind, and it's something you have to think about. And so that kind of presents some struggles, and Res Life was really good about working with us on that, and they have been the whole time. But a completely different aspect is we have guys coming in with families that have wives and children, and we might get some women in at some point that have husbands and their own lives going on. And so trying to work with the college to figure out, how do they get housing? Where do their kids go to school? All those kinds of things that we have to think through and think creatively about, and things that don't necessarily affect a traditional student. Also benefits in healthcare. Trying to transfer that to the VA system is something that a lot of students don't have to worry about. They're under their parents' benefits. They have the student health plan. Trying to navigate that system is something that can be a little challenging. So there's some of the practical issues that we've had to think through as veterans here at the school. But I think Dartmouth has really done a great job of working with us on this. On the front lines, almost every office here is kind of designated the one person that knows about veterans issues. And so if I have a question about my financial aid or the benefits, I know who I can go talk to. And if that's about healthcare, I know which doctor really knows how the VA works and how that interface plays out. And I can kind of get help with that and navigate the process. And another way that we work through this, which falls a lot at the feet of President Wright, is getting more veterans here that can kind of help each other through these steps. Now that we have more veterans here that have been here for a few years, we don't have to relearn the same lessons over again. We know we can go to our community of veterans, ask, "Hey, how do I solve this? What do I do here?" And we already have that figured out. And so it's getting a lot smoother now, and it's making for a much easier transition, I think, overall. So with that said, I think I'm going to turn it over to President Wright, someone that all the vets here owe a lot of gratitude to.
Thank you, Chris. We owe a lot to you, and I can never say that enough, and we can't say it enough. I guess I'm the historian at the table, and I've been working over the last several months on another book on the Vietnam War. And part of what I'm doing for that right now is trying to focus on people who were killed in a specific period of time over there and find out more about them, to put a human face on the war. And I've been interviewing a lot of veterans. I've had support from a variety of veterans groups, and people have self-identified. And I've been having, 2 or 3 interviews a day, it seems, over the phone with people talking, and I'm trying to find out how did this person die and what was he thinking about. And this is 44, 45 years after the fact. And some of these people say to me, I have trouble talking about this, or this is the first time I've talked about it. And of course, a lot of people are not willing to talk about this experience. I think the fact that their willingness to do it here has to do with maybe somebody will finally remember my friend, and if I can help them to remember, I will do that. But they talk. I got an email last night, a follow-up from a Army officer who said, I wanted to write you a couple weeks ago, but it took me 2 weeks to write this. I just had trouble struggling with this. I'm also teaching a seminar, and I was going over some interviews from Marines who have met the Chozon Reservoir this week, and the Chozon Reservoir was in November, December 1950, where the 1st Marine Division was encircled by the Chinese when they came into Korea, and there were maybe 8 or 10 to 1 odds, and the Chinese had the high ground, and it was snowing and below zero, and the 1st Marine Division had 2/3 casualties, and they carried out most of their dead, and I think 75% of them had frostbite. And this one person was talking about it, and he said everybody was talking about how the battle bothered them, and he said, I really moved away from it, and it didn't bother me. And then in 1993, somebody asked me if I would speak about Korea at a local organization. I said, sure, I'll do that. And he said, I sat down to write about the Chozon Reservoir, and he said, as soon as I started writing, I started crying. And now, and this was 17 years later when he had this interview, he said, I've been crying ever since. He said, it took me a long time for this to sink in, what it is that I had suffered and experienced there. I have been visiting the hospital since 2005, I think some 30 sometimes now, and a recent visit I was talking to this one young man who had been deployed 8 times, and on the 9th time he finally received a major injury. And he was very upbeat about it. He had lost a leg and part of another and a piece of an arm in an explosion. And he had had 49 surgeries then, at that time, and he had more to go. And he said, oh, by the way, I've lost all of my reproductive organs. And of course, this is often the untold story about this war because of the IEDs and what it is that happens to these guys. But he said, I'm going to be just fine, and he was very upbeat, and all I can think of is I hope so. But I spoke to somebody, a senior Marine officer who knew him and saw him regularly. He said, this young man has awful hard times. It's just late at night or in the weekends when nobody's around. But he has them, and he's going to have more of it. And so I think that these things pop out sometimes after a long delay. But the important thing is to remember that what we call PTSD today is really as old as warfare, and not surprisingly as old as warfare, because it really has to do with the way human beings respond to some experiences that are just so alien, hopefully, to most human beings. They're asked to do things, to observe things, to see things that most of us are not at all prepared to do. King David, who was a great warrior, said in the 25th Psalms, my heart is sore pained within me, and the terrors of death are fallen upon me. Fearfulness and trembling are come upon me, and horror has overwhelmed me. This is before he was prepared to go into another battle. And Homer in the Odysseus said, must you have battle in your heart forever? The bloody toil of combat. This was Odysseus well after the war, the bloody toil of combat. In our Civil War, it was called Soldier's Heart, or after the war, nostalgia. Not nostalgia in the sort of romanticized sense we think of it today, but it was a psychological term for the time, or war neurosis, some people called it. It was shell shock in World War I. In World War II, and in Korea, we called it combat fatigue or battle fatigue. And in Vietnam, really, as long as the men and women were serving in Vietnam, it was called the Vietnam Syndrome. It was something very specific to that war and the people who were fighting there, and there was something a little strange about it. And throughout all of these wars, the major focus of wartime treatment was to get men back to their units. So various forms of rest or reassurance or oftentimes threats from NCOs or officers. God damn it, shape up and get back. We've got a war to fight, and we need you there. And there was a belief, deeply held, and of course this is true of a lot of psychological disorders, psychiatric conditions. There was a belief that the condition had to do with moral fiber or character, and so that a malingerer was a term that was commonly used in the military for somebody who didn't step up, a malingerer or a coward. And these were often compared to soldiers who were marked by courage and virtue. I remember the classic example of General Patton slapping a soldier in a hospital ward in Italy during World War II because the young man was crying and saying he didn't want to go back to fight. And General Patton slapped him and said, "Damn it, shape up. You're a soldier. We've got fighting to do." And the real irony for me was some of the World War II vets who were dismissive of Vietnam veterans, called them whiners or wimps, and said to them, "Get over it." We did. Of course it bothers you to do these things, but damn it, just get over it. Get on with your life. We all did that. And only in 1980 was PTSD recognized as a clinical condition, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 3. Some today estimate that the incidence of PTSD is higher than in previous wars. I'm not sure of that. There's no good timeline, as Paula said. There's no metric, no way of really knowing this. But I think we have to be very careful running too far with that and trying to make that case. In 1942, 58% of the patients in VA hospitals were World War I veterans who had been diagnosed with what was called shell shock cases. This was well after the war, and they were in VA hospitals at that time. In World War I, it's estimated that 42% of those who were in combat suffered psychiatric problems. In World War II, one estimate was that 37.5% of those who were in combat, again, particularly in more recent wars, that's a smaller percentage of those who were actually serving in uniform who were in combat, but 37.5 were lost duty time due to psychiatric problems, not diagnosed as PTSD, but psychiatric problems. And Vietnam, by some estimates, is lower, despite some stereotypes of the Vietnam War. Again, I would not want to run too far with that either. We just have no good way of comparison. Perhaps today some people talk about levels that may reach 30 to 40%, World War I or World War II levels, but we won't know that for a while, except today the levels relate to all who served in theater. And I think one thing we have to recognize is that in the wars that we fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's harder to identify combat zones in wars. It's harder to say this percentage of those who are in combat, because if you're in theater, as we've learned, everything can be subject to a combat zone. It's just that these are different types of wars without front lines. Perhaps there's a greater willingness to identify these conditions today. The senior military are surely the Pentagon level. The generals are far more understanding of all of this, and there's clearer treatment options that people understand that are available to them. But I think it's also important to remember who is serving in the military today, these young men and young women, where they're from, and it's not always easy for them to come forward and identify themselves. It may be easier than it was before because there is a clinical condition now and some treatment, but nobody should assume it's easy for them to come forward and identify themselves. And it's also the case that not all NCOs and officers are so understanding today. There's still a little bit of a, damn it, get in here and get off your ass and quit whining, and we've got a war to fight. There's still enough of that surely I hear about, that others hear about, that's out there. Wars today are different. Off base, there's little sense of security, and there's not that much traditional combat. The American military today is a remarkable offensive machine with tremendous firepower capacity, well-trained professional leadership, great discipline, and quite frankly, most of the time, very little chance to use these tools. The rules of engagement, the nature of enemy attack are just so far different today from previous wars, and there's a lot of stress that goes along with this. And then the multiple deployments that some people are serving. These really do take a toll, and there's tremendous pressure on families. The last data I saw were that something like 56 or 58% of those serving in the military today are married. And these multiple deployments just create tremendous pressures on everyone. And finally, again, the nature of these wars. I have been going down for 8+ years now at the hospital. I always ask when I go bed to bed what happened, and I could probably count, if I tried to, on a hand or two, all of those who actually saw the person who did them harm. They didn't. It's hard to fight back against that kind of stuff. It's hard to use the offensive capability that they have. And oftentimes, this is more true in Iraq than in Afghanistan. Afghanistan, oftentimes the explosions are happening on patrol, on foot, at least of those that I'm talking to. In Iraq, it was more often inside of a vehicle. And people talk about being inside of this steel vehicle when an explosion goes off, and they've had their bell rung, they say. And we don't need to go any farther than the National Football League, or indeed junior football, to know that this has real consequences. It's not just something that real men shrug off and go on with. And I think the nature of these explosions, people being in enclosed spaces when they go off, the injuries, the mildly traumatic brain injury that results from this, we're going to see the consequences for some time to come. So one thing that General Ham said that I couldn't agree with, I agree with everything he said, but I could not agree more. We're already being distracted from these wars. We're not focusing on it. We're not thinking about it. And the last World War I veteran just died a couple of years ago. Who knows when the Iraq or Afghanistan veteran will die. And we can't move on. It's time for us to focus on these men and women who have served on our behalf, such a small fraction of our population on our behalf, and some of them will be suffering for a long time, and we've got to help them through this suffering.
Well, we've heard 4 remarkable presentations, and I have a million questions, but we don't have time for a million questions. So I think at this point, I'll just open it up to the floor and solicit your questions. There is a microphone or 2 circulating, so please wait for the microphone.
Or we'll stare at each other for 30 minutes.
Well, if there are no questions. Oh, there's a question.
I don't know if I need a microphone.
General, I'd like to direct this question to you. In the military training today, and also to you, Chris, in the military training today, has the military become more sensitive? Has the way they train troops become sensitive to the need for military personnel to be more aware of these problems, how they come about, and how they can be dealt with? Or is basic training like it always was, and then when you go off to Iraq or Afghanistan, are you pretty much considered, you're a soldier and you're going to be in a combat situation? I want to know if the military has changed the way that they prepare their personnel.
I think the military has. Certainly, I retired last summer, but over the past several years, there's been a growing awareness at the institution level of the hazards of brain injury and post-traumatic stress. So there's been a multi-pronged approach. Some of it is just equipment, how do you have better protective gear, both the vehicles and the armament, but individual protection, helmets particularly to protect against brain injury, which has been pretty good. I mean, it's a necessary but incomplete way ahead. And the services, particularly the ground forces, have implemented a series of reviews. So when I was serving, as many did, you'd get hit by an IED, and as long as you weren't wounded, or you'd kind of go back about you get a new vehicle and you go back about your business the next day. That no longer happens if you're susceptible, if you're subjected to an attack. There's an evaluation phase, a bit of a stand down that is mandated. That said, okay, we're going to go through a period of evaluation to make sure that there's no adverse concussive effect or what have you. But having said all that, that's all policy from on high that says this is what we're going to do. It gets really tough at the platoon level to say, I'm not going to go out with you guys because yesterday I was close to a mortar strike, or I was in a vehicle that was struck by an IED. That's not our culture. The culture is you stay with your unit, and so there's still a lot of pressure to do that, and still, as President Wright said, there is still this. You're walking and you're not bleeding, therefore you should be with your troops. So I guess I'd say in balance that the system is starting to put in place and has put in place some good procedures, but the implementation of that is varied because of the nature of service culture. Chris, you're a lot closer to it than I am.
So I don't think I was in long enough to really speak to any changes to basic training or anything like that. But as far as the actual implementation on the ground, when you're subjected to an explosion or something like that. So I was route clearance in Iraq. That was our whole job. It was a successful day if we blew up because we were in the trucks that could take it versus someone else in a convoy. That was a win for us. So it happened quite a bit. So we were always evaluated. It was just standard procedure, I'd get back to base and you're always evaluated right away. You went through a kind of a barrage of tests. And so the framework was there to be evaluated, but being in a combat unit, just from my personal experience, I didn't always tell the truth. If I got my bell rung, I wasn't going to tell anyone and then not go back out with my squad the next day. We ran missions every single day, and I wasn't going to be the guy that missed out on that. So I'm just reiterating what the general said. It seems like command put everything there that should be there, but you can't just change mindset overnight, especially in some of these units where you just spend so much time together. You don't want to be the one to let anyone down. So I know that's something that I personally did on a regular basis.
What you have just said is the team spirit pervades. And that is started in the 5th grade. And that's what keeps you there, is the team spirit. Would you agree?
Absolutely. The camaraderie and brotherhood or sisterhood that you feel in the military is second to none. To try to explain it to someone that hasn't been there is next to impossible. These are people that you're sleeping with, eating with, fighting with, spending every second of your day in a combat zone where your lives depend on each other. The teamwork there can't be overstated. I've never experienced anything like it. I've played sports my whole life. I've been on a lot of teams. Nothing comes close to it. I've definitely not given my all in a football game or two. I've never done that in Iraq. So.
Each of you has addressed the kind of experience where a military person has experienced something that's happened to them, there's been an explosion, you haven't seen who did this to you. What I'd like to better understand, and I don't know whom to ask, this can be from any of you, when a military person is in a leadership position, an officer who has to make calls, decisions that impact his company, his platoon, or impacts the other side, and I won't call it an enemy because I don't think these are people. So how would you explain or describe the impact of that decision-making experience where you haven't been, in an explosion, but you certainly have suffered because of the decisions that you've had to make?
I'll try, ma'am, because what you just described me. I mean, I was a one-star general. I wasn't out on patrol in the streets in direct combat, at least not very often. And if I was, I was surrounded by a bunch of guys who weren't going to let anything happen to me. So that was a lot different than Chris's experience. The worst for me was losing soldiers being killed or wounded, knowing that they were killed or wounded following an order that I had given. I sent them there, and I don't suppose you ever get over that. The best you can do is say, was it the right decision? And I think those decisions were right, though they had tragic consequences. It is perhaps the worst burden of leadership. I wish I could forget that, but you can't. You deal with that, and it's not an easy thing, and it's one of the reasons why I personally needed some help to get me through that. Some officers don't, and some are able to cope with that. But I don't know of any of my peers or any others who don't think about that, who don't bear that weight. And I think that is just part of the responsibility of command that you assume when you take on the privilege of leading American soldiers.
Could I comment too? Well, I certainly can't speak from personal experience, but the general story is very similar to General Romeo Dallaire, who led the UN peacekeeping forces in Rwanda. And he's been very public about having PTSD because he feels that by following orders rather than disobeying, that he is personally responsible for the deaths of thousands, especially children. And there's a wonderful book he's written, there's a documentary about this. He feels that PTSD is different in officers, that there's something about this kind of responsibility where you've had to make these sorts of decisions. And I can only read it as an academic in an abstract way, but I trust that's true. I think we've just heard the general say that, and I think that it's very much a challenge for an individual then to decide what to do afterwards. In his case, he does a lot of, he's giving back, and he does a lot of volunteer work, especially focused on children. But he's also, like the general, I think done a lot in giving back by being public about his own problems. He has bad PTSD, for example, and so the fact that he's been able to tell that story has helped the Canadian military substantially in terms of making PTSD something that's not a four-letter word.
Paula, can you perhaps clarify something for us then? Sure. I think that there's a general impression, or maybe I'm the only one laboring under it, if it's a misimpression, that some precondition or an essential factor of PTSD involves some kind of concussion, some kind of concussive force to the brain, but that is not true. You can have it without actually having any direct physical affect.
Most people who have PTSD were never injured at all in the course of that. I mean, even in an auto accident, the essential feature of PTSD is the experience of a terrifying event. And certainly events in which you have a brain injury often would be terrifying, but probably not if you're playing football, for example. So again, most people never have that sort of injury, and it's not necessary, it's not causal in any way to the PTSD.
Along the same line,
Can you just wait for the mic?
keep talking about an event or some trauma, some particular trauma. How often do you find that it's cumulative rather than eventful, so that the stress of commanding a group where you lose people week after week or time after time, is that something that you run across frequently?
It's very commonly cumulative. For example, a woman or a man who's in a situation of domestic violence is experiencing over a long period of time, a child who's being physically or sexually abused, again, over a long period of time. And in a war zone, there are many episodes, although often people will single out one of the entire tour or multiple tours that stands out. Firefighters, police who develop PTSD often say the same thing. And so the way we think about it is all of these other things add up, but often there's a tipping point, and that tipping point may be different for different individuals.
Hi, I have a comment and a question. I'm the co-founder of Project Vet Care that assists a lot of veterans here, and there's a thread that I think me and my co-founder Danielle Goodwin see in many of the vets, almost all of them, is the fact is that PTSD seems to be related to, or not related, but that the coping mechanism is that people shut down and they don't talk about these things, you know, and you see it over and over and over again, vets that are coming in, and when they start talking about these stories, you know, their wives are sitting there and they've never heard this. They've been married 45 years, never heard any of these things, and that seems to be a consistent thread of people. Another problem, and maybe you can offer some suggestions for it in trying to help veterans access the benefits that they've earned, you know, through service to our country, is that many of these vets are so macho that they say, well, there's nothing wrong with me. And, you know, there's an example of one that, you know, he's divorced because he was beating his wife. He's been arrested for alcoholism, but there's nothing wrong with him, you know. And we see that not in everybody, but in a large number of the vets that we are trying to assist, that they, you know, we're trying to help them access those benefits, and, you know, they refuse to admit that there's anything wrong with them. Is there anything that we can do that might help that?
Well, I think there's recognition of that, and it's, but it's very difficult. Of how do you overcome a military culture that says I'm expected to be strong. I'm expected to. I mean, the nation, you know, is depending on me to stand up to adversity, and if I admit that I need some help, I'm showing weakness, and I'm not supposed to. So I think we, again, as President Wright and others have said, the senior civilian and military leadership of our nation understands that and encourages people to come forward. But it's a very different thing when it gets to the individual level and say, okay, am I ready to admit to my buddies, to my family, to my friends, that I need some help? I mean, I wrestled with that. I didn't want to do that. I didn't, and I think again, it's this. We have to create a climate and a culture that says it is okay. The courage is in stepping forward and saying, I need a little bit of help, rather than braving this, as the individual you cited that said, you know, I don't have a problem. That's easier to talk about than it is to actually get it done. We know what the right thing to do is, but how do you encourage others to come forward? That's probably the toughest thing we have to wrestle with. Because once you come forward, she's here. You know, I mean, there's lots of systems to help you. But if she doesn't know you need help, she can't help you.
Hello, since my name was already mentioned, my name is Danielle Goodwin, and I am also the co-founder of Project Vet Care here in Hanover. And General Ham, this is directly for you, just kind of following up on a couple of your comments. I am a proud 19 Delta spouse out of Fort Drum, 10th Mountain, and I know that if those guys came anywhere near the psych building on base, guess what? They're not deploying, so they're not going to say anything.
Right.
And as you know, Fort Drum is the most deployed base in the world. I mean, where do you go with that? I mean, I personally was the FRG leader. I can tell you every one of those guys, PTSD was way up here. But I think that if they had seen General Ham walk into the psych building first, you know they would have gone right behind you. If a platoon leader would have gone in first, same thing. So how do you change that? How do you fix it? Because, you know, Military One Source and all the sexy, glossy stuff that they have, nobody's going that route because it sends a direct email to the command. Guess what? They don't want that.
No, I think you're right. My son-in-law also deployed out of Fort Drum. My daughter was an FRG leader, and you're right. There is a pride, there is a camaraderie, and just as Chris has said, sometimes, you know, you'll keep things inside if you think there's any risk that I'm going to be separated from my unit. I mean, that's the ultimate penalty, is being separated from my unit and my buddies deployed and being in harm's way, and I'm not there with them. I'm not carrying my share of the load. So I think you hit on the solution. I think it is the responsibility of leaders at all levels, and frankly, lieutenants are more influential than generals, and sergeants are more influential than senior sergeants major in this regard, because that's who's interacting with soldiers, and to be able to demonstrate, not just say the words, but demonstrate by their actions that, hey, I'll go with you, and we'll get some help, but I'm gonna, you're gonna still be part of this unit. I think we're getting better, but I think it's incrementally getting better, and there's still a significant stigma attached to it. Some of us talked earlier today. I worry in an era where the size of the force is going to decline pretty significantly, and re-enlistment and retention is going to become more and more difficult. That's yet another barrier for a soldier to say, if I admit that I need some counseling, that I need some help for PTSD, is that a check mark that says, we like Ham, we like you as a soldier, but we're not going to let you re-enlist because you have that aspect of your career. I worry a lot about that as we move forward.
Right now, because those psych records are part of the permanent jacket that is going with them. And guess what? They're not getting promoted, especially in the combat troops, because they don't want some soldier with PTSD over in theater having an issue. So
Yeah.
what if they took here's the PTSD line, we're not going to write anything down. There's not going to be a single computer or paper or anything.
Well, we had some of that, as you know, and now the term escapes me, but the post-deployment counselors where there were no records and there were no appointments, you could walk in, and that was very helpful, but it was short-term and there was no continuity of care. So the program, and Danielle will remember the name, that when units returned from deployment, it would bring mental health professionals from civilian communities mostly, and the Army would contract with them for about 90 days, and they'd provide 90 days of care. No records, nothing got in your medical records. There were no notes taken, no notification back to the chain of command, and the soldiers and the families loved it. But at the end of 90 days, that person went away, but the requirement for care continued, and there was no mechanism for the anonymity of that kind of care continuing. So we got to figure that out.
Paula, I have a question that has to do with improving the intake of officers or military people. If you come in and you have your physical and your blood pressure is too high, or you weigh too much, or your vision's not up to par, they don't take you. They're selecting the best. Do you have anything available that could help you select against people who would be more susceptible to PTSD, so you get a better group of officers and military people?
The short answer is no. And rather what we do have would be more harmful than helpful, because we can predict at a group level, statistically, on average, if you have certain characteristics, you might be more likely. But because so many factors come into play other than who the individual is before they enter the military, that I don't think we'll ever be able to adequately predict, except in a very gross way. And I think we already do that. You know, there's something called the healthy veteran effect. It's a healthy worker effect, where on average the health of veterans is better than the health of the general population, because we do this screening at entry, and some of it is psychiatric screening. But I think that, my opinion, unless our science moves in a very accelerated and brilliant direction, we're never going to be able to find like that thing about you, that gene or that experience you've had, that characteristic that's going to make it too risky for you to go into combat, at least it more so than we're doing now. Rather, I think the things we're talking about, which are monitoring people in service, helping them when they have traumatic experiences in service, and responding rapidly, even though Chris is not going to tell the truth when he's asked, right? Because people don't want to be sent to the rear or something. If we can work on that, we'll do a better job.
For the 80% who don't have PTSD and are coming back, I wonder if you have any perspective on the difference between Vietnam veterans and Iraq and Afghanistan veterans in terms of how the country seems more grateful and respectful now compared to post-Vietnam, and also how that may or may not relate to the difference between the draft of Vietnam and the all-volunteer currently.
Tom, is that question for me? One of my collaborators is a plant in the audience.
Well, you just had to watch the Super Bowl to see how different things have become because of the endless, really, glorification of service members. That certainly is quite striking. You wouldn't have seen that in the Super Bowl in 1973, 74, 75. That's just an instance. That's an amateur insight.
It helps. I mean, the more supportive, I mentioned the recovery environment is really important. And people coming back home, it's not simple even in the best case scenario. But what I think happened in Vietnam is that it was destructive. So in Korea, a lot of people came home and they were sort of forgotten and not as celebrated. World War II, they were very celebrated, and a large part of the country was involved with family members or friends. But I think that what we're doing is right, but we can still go further in promoting greater understanding of the issues that people face. Because I think, Chris, you raised this, or maybe it came up in conversation. Without a draft, most people don't know any veterans. And I have to assume that I'm seeing a lot of the veterans who live in the Upper Valley today because you came here. And so I think the general public cares about war, but doesn't understand it in a way that even in Vietnam they did, because there were more people serving and it was a much more random sample of the population who were affected. I don't know, other people on the panel may have something to say here.
It's interesting. I think the conversations we're having now and the way that we're trying within the military and outside the military to urge people to come forward to offer treatment to them is crucial. But I also sometimes think about a little bit of a double-edged sword here. One of it is within military units, you know. Do you really go forward and self-identify? What are going to be the consequences of that? Because in these wars, people are part of units. Unlike Vietnam, where there was individual rotation, in Korea, when there was individual rotation, these units have stayed together. They've come from Fort Drum or Fort Campbell or wherever, and they're going back there together, and that's terribly important. But even with the broader population, I worry about a slight double-edged sword from all of this. I wonder if we set out a presumption about a lot of psychotic veterans out there, that you know, Paula had talked about the catch-all phrase, and wondering if everyone is crazy, and Chris said there are certain connotations when you talk to people and say you're a veteran. And I've been on panels talking, for example, about unemployment data and trying to understand why is it that veterans lag a bit, particularly recent veterans, Chris's veterans, not veterans of Vietnam or Korea or World War II, but the younger veterans are lagging. And a lot of this has to do with education, but I also think if you hold everything constant, they're still lagging. I think there is a presumption, you know, are these guys all going to be a little bit crazy? And in Vietnam, we saw it coming home before PTSD was ever identified. The idea of, you know, the taxi driver, the movie Taxi Driver. I remember, I mentioned this in my book, a Kojak episode in the early 1970s when there had been a series of murders downtown in New York. And Kojak orders some of the people in the office, Telly Savalas, for those of you not of the generation, was Officer Kojak. It was a great television show. And Kojak simply said, find out if there are any Vietnam veterans who have been discharged recently in the neighborhood. This is a way of getting at it. The idea of going postal. The assumptions that we make often about mental illness that are so unfair and so cruel. And in these cases, I think they even take on a deeper edge of unfairness and cruelty.
I probably do without this, but
But then they can't hear you on the way.
yeah, that's right. Since I'm a retired lieutenant, so whenever there's a general in the room, I feel it necessary to stand up, and I'm very comfortable with it, sir. First, I just want to thank all five of you
Could
for.
you talk to my children?
Yeah, mine too. I want to thank all five of you for your very varied but related service. It gives me a lot of reassurance. As I said, I'm a combat vet of Vietnam, but probably of the Vietnam War, but probably more importantly, for 16 years, starting in the mid-'80s, I worked with a joint program that Outward Bound and the VA did together to take guys who'd been diagnosed by the VA with PTSD out on short wilderness trips to try to bring them back to remember some of the good things about their service, some of the pride, getting through tough situations, et cetera. I'm very concerned about what's going to happen to today's young guys and women now coming home 10 years down the road, 25 years down the road, because we saw troubled Vietnam vets over a period of 25 or 30 years, long after they'd gotten out of the service. And so maybe this is directed to you, Paula, but is the VA got any sort of long-range planning in mind to continue to reach out to this now aging veteran population and make sure they get help when they want it? Thanks.
Well, maybe an interesting statistic that won't surprise you is that still the largest number of veterans coming for PTSD care in the VA are Vietnam veterans. Many veterans did not seek care, or they sought it when we didn't have such good care to offer, and the message they got was, I have to live with this. There's an Office of Policy and Planning, and they're making projections for the needs of the veteran population, out 20, 30 plus years. But the hope is that, because we do have better treatments now. I mean, some people actually seem to be cured Some people are a whole lot better, and the majority of people, we see improvements even in the people who don't respond that much, are much better than anything we had to offer when we first put PTSD on the map. So I don't want to be simplistic here. Some people will struggle perhaps their whole lives, but hopefully we'll have far fewer people in the situation that many Vietnam veterans find themselves. Now, good news, Vietnam vets are coming in, even Korean War vets are coming in, and they're getting help and feeling better now after, how many years, in some cases 50+ years. And so we're trying to prevent the problem that happened to your generation or generations beforehand, and that's our first line of attacks.
I'd like to know, once you've diagnosed someone with these problems, and you say we've got much better treatments, I'd like to have you kind of walk us through a general way that you approach the patient, the person who needs the help. Well, what does this better treatment include? Why does it work better? What have you learned? I mean, I'd like to know that side of the story.
Well, clinicians vary. I'm not a clinician, so I wouldn't be in this position of telling a patient, but I do some work on this, so I'm telling you from an armchair perspective. But first of all, making sure people understand what they have. As I said, most people don't fully understand PTSD. They either think it's nothing. Many people, when they learn about it, realize, oh my God, I've had PTSD for a long time. So the first thing someone would do is try to make sure you understand what it is, and then inform you about the options. There's medications, there's psychotherapy. These are the pros and cons of the various approaches. We would tell you generally about psychotherapy, the ones that are most effective. For many people, it's just 10 or 12 sessions. For some people, it's longer than that, or it's additional treatment following. But what we would try to do is tell you about the specific treatment, so you could say, that works for me. Like one treatment, excuse me, I have a little thing going on with my throat. One treatment requires focusing over and over on the traumatic experience you've had. For example, the suicide bombing, you would tell it over and over with the idea that eventually you're going to process it, and you're going to decrease the pain that it's causing by this repetition. So you may hear about that and say, no, thank you. I don't want to do that. That also requires homework. We're going to put it on your smartphone or on a tape and have you take it home and listen. But you know what? This treatment's really effective. It really works. Other treatments are going to require that you focus on your thoughts instead, and you may have to do a very different kind of homework. Rather than listening to a tape, you're going to be doing a lot of writing, and you may not want that kind of treatment. So we're going to try, in the best care, we're going to try to tell you what's involved and then let you pick which of these treatment options you want to get involved in. Some people don't want to talk, they just want medication, and we'll tell you about the side effects and so on. Does that help? Is that what you were asking me for?
Yeah, I was concerned about how you approach someone with PTSD, what kinds of treatment you offered them, as opposed to the suggestion that it wasn't as good in the past. And I mean, obviously, you probably didn't have the medications we have today in the past, or knew how they worked. I mean, I had an uncle in World War II who suffered from shell shock and missing in action in the Pacific, and he would never, ever in his long life talk about it, not even once. I had a brother-in-law who came back from Vietnam who was absolutely destroyed. He was a Marine captain in the artillery on the DMZ. Ended up dying from, I think, Agent Orange, but they never admitted it. He was a mess, and he was a total mess. And it just, you wonder what kinds of treatments might work and what might not work, and the new experimental things that they're trying all the time. I just wonder, as a layman, if what do we look for? I mean, obviously wives know right away if you're coming home and you're not who you were. But I wonder how teachers, classmates, can spot what they can see, what they can look for, how they might be with someone else. All of those things, I think, are part of the equation.
Absolutely, and I think maybe General Ham, you can also comment on this because of your own experiences, but everybody in the room can play a part. Sometimes just listening and just being knowledgeable is all you need. I mean, people worry, well, I say the wrong thing, I don't know enough, but anybody who's a veteran in the room, anyone who has struggled with readjustment, I think will appreciate the simple fact that you care. But being informed helps a lot, and understanding, as I said, like not everybody has PTSD, and a lot of people have other issues that need to be dealt with. General, would you want to comment here? Because I think you...
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a great question. I think a supportive environment is absolutely key. Recognize, for me, just a simple recognition that this is not all that unique. I mean, this isn't something, you're not the first person in the world that's ever struggled with this stuff. To don't know that there are others and you can learn from their experiences, I think are quite valuable. The other thing the services are trying to do and again, we discussed this earlier today, I think without any clinical evidence of positive result, but trying to get in front of it a little bit. How do you, are there some tools that can be used, some processes that can increase resiliency, so that when you are subjected to a traumatic event, that the effect is not so great and the recovery is faster. It's good in theory. I think Paula would say we haven't yet seen the rigor in the assessment that says the programs that have been in place are actually resulting in that, but I think that's a component of how we move forward.
Just something from a larger perspective, but I'm a Vietnam War veteran, and the veterans that are coming home today don't have the same sort of economic environment that I had. I was able to find a job, and that job provided productive employment for me and things in my family. And today we have a middle class that's disappearing, and if these guys don't have economic support, I mean, my own perspective about why we're seeing so many suicides is they can't support their families, they're not getting, they don't have the economic means to support their families, and this PTSD is just driving them into suicide. So we need to be very careful with these younger guys that are coming in, that you're probably going to see a larger percentage of them that fall off the cliff because they're involved in their own thoughts and don't have that economic support that we were able to find, in the job environment.
If I could, just a very brief comment. There are a lot of initiatives at the national level. The First Lady has a Joining Forces initiative and others, and there are many localized efforts that are focused on finding employment opportunities for veterans that are certainly deeply appreciated. But the counter to that is, as Paula talked about, there's I think in many employers, particularly small business employers, there's a fear. Are all these veterans crazy? Are they all suffering? Can I count on them? Are they going to be reliable employees? And so there's a tension there that I think we've got to, again, as a nation, this is a national issue. We've got to figure out how do we make sure that employers understand, veterans are good. Frankly, even veterans that have had some problem, I think, I don't mean to pat myself on the back, but I'm doing okay, and I got it, that I'm older and have been afforded a lot of different opportunities that others haven't, but we can work our way through this, and we need to. But I think you hit a very vital point, because your self-worth, if I'm unemployed, I'm not feeling real good about myself.
Okay, just a minute. Last question.
I know that a number of the servicemen today don't even say PTSD, they say PTS, because the D is a disorder. And you couldn't go back to a unit as a key player or a commander if you had a psychiatric disorder. But if we called it post-traumatic experience, or not even that, traumatic experience. I think I would have more confidence in somebody that had experienced some trauma and gotten through it. But when we talk about PTSD, you sound like you're already classified as having a disorder. And there's not many ways out of that. If you knew that a commander in your unit had traumatic stress experience and was still functioning capably, you could actually have more confidence in him. And in a way, by mentioning that it's a psychiatric disorder, you cut off certainly within the culture of the Marines and the SEALs and the Special Forces guys, you've sort of prohibited them from moving on.
You want me to answer that?
Sure.
Okay, I think I get last call here.
Well, I'm going to ask another question at the end, so that's okay.
Okay, that's good. By the way we define psychiatric disorder, PTSD is a disorder. And I have a different take on it, and it's more aligned with what they did in Canada. But I think that by taking away that D, we're sort of playing into the stigma. It's okay to have PTSD. You can count on people who have, you can love people who have PTSD. So I'd rather make it okay to have PTSD than hide the D when it really exists. What they did in Canada is they created a class. They recognized that a lot of things happen in a war zone. They call them operational stress injuries. Some of them are physical, some of them are mental. PTSD's in there. Now, Canada has a lot of good ideas, you know, and this, I think, is one of them, and probably Romeo Dallaire helped influence that kind of policy. But in that case, we just said, it's okay to have PTSD. It just happens sometimes when people deploy. And so my take on this would be a different strategy. Let's not hide it, let's just call it for what it is and say it's okay.
Well, I'm going to abuse the prerogative of the chair and ask a closing question. We're actually 5 minutes past the time we should have ended, but 3 or 4 inches of snow have fallen, so no one's in a hurry to get anywhere right now. But this is perhaps best directed at President Wright, but I think a lot of people on the panel will have a view, and I'm just curious, having studied how America treated veterans coming home over the great historical sweep, whether you think that we are building both the societal but also the government infrastructure to deal with a problem that, and this is really coming back to Mike Haney's question, to deal with a problem that is going to be with us for several decades to come. You know, during several years ago, there was a huge controversy over the long-term costs of the wars within the War on Terror. And there was huge outrage when people talked about $1 trillion bill overall. And I'm just wondering whether you think we have now accepted that the tail to this conflict is going to go on, and that we're going to be prepared to pay those bills and have the kind of elaborated Veterans Administration that we need. A lot's been made of working through the backlog, and VA's made huge progress in that regard. But this is a big problem. It's going to be a big problem for a long, long time.
Yeah, simple answer, Daniel, is no, not at all. We have not done that. In fact, these 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are the first wars in American history. We haven't had some sort of wartime tax to pay for it. We are building up a debt for this. We're going to ask these kids coming home from these wars to help pay the debt on their wars. And we've never done that before, but who in Washington has talked about a tax to pay for these wars or talk about a tax for anything? So we're not doing that. I don't think we've begun to understand what it is that we're asking them to do. There's tremendous applause for veterans. There's a warmth that the Vietnam veterans never experienced, but people don't know these veterans. It's about half of 1% of our population. They're not even representative. It's not even a half of 1% of those in this room. They're not representative of our country and our society. We don't know them. We happily applaud them at a ball game. We cheer especially hard if somebody's in a wheelchair or with crutches. Then we move on very quickly because we don't know what they've experienced. We don't know what they've done. We don't know what we've asked them to do, what they've done on our behalf, and we have no idea what it is that they're going to encounter and have to deal with for a lot of years going forward, some of them. So I worry a lot about that because, as the general said, we're already distracted. I mean, the corporate America, I think, peaked in the amount of money it gave to support veterans' activities in something like 2006, 2007. They've moved on. It's not that they're not promoting veterans and doing things, but it's time that we face up to the real cost, and that only a few people have borne this cost, and we have an obligation to them.
Anyone want to add, or?
I can't top that.
It's kind of a showstopper, that one. Yeah. Okay, well, let me thank you all for coming on this rather gloomy afternoon, and I hope you've enjoyed this very provocative and interesting panel.